Dr. Kathryn Bocanegra, LCSW and PhD, has more than 15 years of experience in clinical, administrative, and research experience in community-based mental health and public safety. Currently, she is a postdoctoral fellow at Loyola University of Chicago's Center for Criminal Justice Research, Policy, and Practice. She received her PhD in Social Service Administration from the University of Chicago, where she was awarded the National Institute of Justice's Graduate Research Fellowship for her work on the impact of criminal justice interventions on neighborhood safety and developmental life course trajectories. Dr. Bocanegra's clinical experience is rooted in working with community-based mental health providers to provide trauma-informed programs supporting crime survivors. For over 10 years, she has run support groups and trained providers on how to assist families of homicide victims. As a result of her work with crime survivors, Dr. Bocanegra has been appointed to several state commissions to inform policy and practice reform efforts. She is married to Eddie Bocanegra, and together they have 5 young daughters, and one on the way. They are grateful parishioners of Christ the Savior Orthodox Church. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bocanegra.
Good morning. Okay, figuring out which mic works. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a blessing to be here, and I'm very thankful for the invitation that was initiated by Dr. Philip Mamalakis. I have been following the work of Ocamper, and I'm very pleased to be here, especially in a parish that I grew up in, where my father serves as a deacon, and where many of my former Sunday school teachers are in the audience. So there's that's very humbling, being here as a doctor and facing your former Sunday school teachers who probably wondered if you were awake after liturgy in their class. So the introduction I feel like was sufficient, but I just want to ground a little bit more of my experience and the perspective from which I will be speaking this morning in the Chicago context of urban violence. I don't have a clicker, so I'm just going to rely on Sandra. I'm going to take this. Okay, so here are the goals of what I hope to be gained through the presentation this morning. First is to contextualize urban violence and proximity to our conference's location. Okay, we're in Glenview, Illinois, in very close proximity to a city that's been deemed as the most violent in our nation, and even nicknamed Chirac. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit. The second is to describe corresponding trauma responses related to urban violence, to generate awareness on existing programs and interventions, and then explore what opportunity this provides for our church and for our faith in reaching those who've been affected by community violence and what we can do to assist in their trauma recovery. So, I'm going to just highlight some of the many headlines that have framed the Chicago context of urban violence. You see here that it is frequently cited, typically on a Monday, after a weekend in which people who have been affected by gun violence or lost their lives, what is the tally of lives lost or affected by gun violence? This is the topic of every public radio station, every news outlet, and usually, I would say, a casual conversation that happens in workplaces while you're drinking coffee or exchanging weekend remarks with your coworker. Hey, did you hear what happened over the weekend, or how many were shot, or how many were killed? And so this is, I would say, something that's been normalized and is widespread in Chicago. And we're talking about 10 miles from here, from the city limit. So, unfortunately, the maps didn't come out in the projection as clear as I would wish, but I want to describe a little bit more and in more detail where the violence is concentrated. Because when you see headlines like that, or they talk about Chicago as Chirac, it gives the impression that every resident of Chicago is at equal risk of experiencing violence, or that all neighborhoods are equally affected by violence, and that's not true. And as somebody who looks at data and does a lot of spatial analysis, I'm often drawn to maps as a very powerful educational and visual tool for understanding social issues within context, okay? So if you look all the way to the far left map, okay, this is, should I use this one instead? Oh, for the recording, okay. This is the ways in which the colors are distinguished from each other is by census tract. Okay, so this is at a pretty micro geographical level where you're looking at around 3,000 to 4,000 residents in each one of the little squares. And the darker red colors reflect higher levels of gun violence deaths. Okay, so what you can see in Chicago, I should say, goes like this. Okay, so where you see white doesn't mean that Chicago's not there. It means that nothing's happening there. Okay, according to the different maps that I've described. All right, so if we look at gun violence deaths over here, we see that on the north side of Chicago, here's O'Hare Airport, we're somewhere up here right now. Okay, that there's no gun violence or lives that are lost to gun violence. But as you move south and west in the city, you see a concentration of deaths associated with gun violence. Similarly, when you move south in the city, you see a concentration of gun violence and associated deaths. All right? And so that leads you to question, why is gun violence concentrated in certain places and non-existent in others? All right? And so moving on to the middle map, this is the map of the median income in Chicago, okay? The darker colors reflect areas of higher levels of poverty, where there's a larger proportion of people living under the federal poverty line. All right? And as you can see, on the north side of Chicago, you don't have any families living in the dark green, which is several standard deviations below the federal poverty line. And if you look at the west side of Chicago, and pretty much the entire south side, we're in a dark green zone, which means you have families living well below the federal poverty line. All right, and then finally, the map over here, which again I apologize for the poor quality of the projection, is looking at the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhoods that we're reflecting upon. Okay, so the darker colors, so the blue and the dark green, are reflecting higher proportion of minority residents. So that is African American or Hispanic residents. And so we see that there's a very low proportion, okay, of racial and ethnic minorities in the north and side of Chicago in the centers. And then if you're looking at the west side and south side of Chicago, all right, that you see is disproportionately African American and Hispanic neighborhoods, all right? And I also just want to emphasize the very stark contrast, okay, that you basically see it's all one kind of racial and ethnic composition in different neighborhoods in Chicago. So what I would say is that from an empirical standpoint, studies have been conducted examining the relationships between these three maps. What is the relationship between poverty and violence and race? And so what is visually evident to us has been confirmed by research, and it's very intuitive and reflected in a lot of the narratives that are promoted around Chicago's violence and in other urban centers. That where you find the poorest neighborhoods, you also find the highest rate of residential segregation, okay, in which people who identify as African American or Hispanic are isolated, have less resources, social opportunity, and most likely to be exposed to community violence, okay? So the reason I put this out there is that I hope that when I talk about the psychological consequences of violence and trauma, that it's not reduced to a set of individual symptoms, okay? that violence happens to certain people because they deserve it, or that it's warranted based on their lifestyle, that it is contextual, it is often, their exposure to violence is often outside of their control and heavily contingent upon the context in which they reside. Okay, so we can move to the next. All right, so before we play I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice experience. And so for 12 years in Chicago, I've been running support groups for families that have lost children to violence, in addition to doing community mental health work ranging from intensive case management, home-based care, outpatient care. I've worked in schools, I've worked in state-run facilities, I've worked with adults in residential care, emergency shelters, all on the south side and the west side of Chicago. And my work as a mental health practitioner led me to a career in public safety, because what I found is the predominant, I would say, factor involved in the distress of the people that I was working with was their exposure to violence. And as a clinician, I felt constrained by my role, because they were supposed to come in and meet with me for 1 hour a week in my office, and then go back into the same communities, into the same context of social distress, and continue to function as we normally or without any kind of impairment. And I felt that more was needed, okay? More was needed than 1 hour of counseling that I was able to provide. And so I began getting involved in community networks and reaching out to other community organizations and getting involved in community initiatives to improve the quality of life of residents in those darkly shaded areas, okay, on the west side and south side of Chicago. And that led to a job opportunity to work as the violence prevention director for a community development corporation on the southwest side of Chicago called Enlace, which had an entire violence prevention team that engaged in activities ranging from prevention all the way to intervention work. And I ran all of those programs, started neighborhood coalitions, and then got involved in broader work around reforming the criminal justice system, engaging law enforcement, and looking statewide around how to reduce victimization and promote trauma recovery of those affected by violence. So that's my practice experience. The reason I put up this photo, and this is a funeral of a young man who was shot, died, Chicago South Side, in 2016, is that these are the families that have informed my perspective and my work. And I hope that in being here, I can be a good steward of their experience and their narrative, as it often gets overlooked when we think about urban violence and what responses survivors want as it relates to their own trauma recovery. So I'm going to play a 1.5-minute clip, okay, of a documentary that came out 7-8 years ago that was done through PBS and Frontline Media called The Interrupters. And the reason I want to share this is that it provides a brief visualization of the level of trauma that is experienced across neighborhoods in Chicago as a result of violence, okay? When you walk through these neighborhoods, it is like walking through a mass grave, all right? That's what it's like. And you see public memorials honoring those who've lost their lives to gun violence everywhere. This is a normal experience of young people who walk to school, mothers who are going to work, young men who are trying to navigate their identity formation. All right, this is a normalized experience, but I can't imagine having grown up 3 miles from here, walking to school and seeing a site of execution every day when I walk to school. Okay, so I'm going to play a brief scene from this documentary, and it's free. You can go onto pbs.com and look up The Interrupters and see a much fuller depiction of what Chicago violence is like.
Left side.
And so that last site is an underpass undergoing the CTA in which people write the names of the deceased due to gun violence. And you saw that a young person had written in one of those blocks that I am next. And so I'm going to now move into, because I'm the psychological speaker, what the consequences of exposure to community violence is through a trauma lens. And that I'm very excited to talk about two major advances in scientific research around trauma that have really changed practice in terms of clinical practice. It's changed practice in terms of how we think about public safety, and now it's reaching how we think about criminal justice practice, ranging from policing all the way to parole. So the two main areas of scientific research that have really advanced practice in trauma recovery and in public safety are around adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. Are these terms familiar, unfamiliar to those in the room? Okay. So adverse childhood experiences is a massive retrospective study that came out of California that looked at what are the longitudinal consequences of having some experience of neglect, violence, traumatic separation in critical developmental phase, primarily before the age of 18. So in this study, they asked adults, okay, if you could just catalog or check off what kind of traumatic experiences or adverse experiences you had in your youth, and then they're tracking their health outcomes over time. All right, this is also called the ACEs study. And what they found is that young people who've been exposed to multiple forms of trauma, okay, whether it's separation from a parent, some form of abuse or neglect, okay, that they have adverse or negative health outcomes across their life. So that includes inflammatory diseases, so things like diabetes, asthma is more prevalent, heart disease. They have shorter life expectancy. There are rampant mental health issues around anxiety, traumatic stress, depression, and that the higher your ACE score, the more severe all of those consequences are. All right, so what it did was it connected the exposure to trauma to health consequences, and then they also noticed that these negative experiences were concentrated among young people of color. And so when we look at the health outcomes later in life, you know, who's most at risk of diabetes, who's most at risk of cancer and heart disease, things like that, they're starting to connect it to traumatic or adverse experiences earlier in life. The second major area of scientific research is changing the way we understand exposure to violence is complex trauma. So I'm going to assume that most people have heard of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this is a diagnostic category that describes behaviors and cognitions that are affected by an exposure to a traumatic event. Okay, but implicit in the title of post-traumatic stress disorder is the assumption that that traumatic stressor or exposure was finite and complete and over, right? And that what the person is experiencing is a repercussion as a result of that exposure, but that there's no ongoing, okay, traumatic stressor in their life. And they found, and there's a group of researchers that are involved in forums like the National Child Traumatic Stress Network or the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies that have been advocating for over a decade that we need to create a new diagnostic category or way of understanding traumatic stress through this lens of complex trauma. How do you describe the behaviors, life trajectories, and consequences of chronic exposure to violence, relentless exposure to violence? The kind of, you know, the little montage of execution sites in Chicago that I just reflected upon. What is that lifelong consequence for young people who are growing up in communities in which they're constantly fearful for their safety? They're unsure if they're going to live until the age of 18 and live with that kind of fear and anxiety into their adulthood. Okay? And so these, and you can go to the next slide. These two areas of research, okay, have helped deepen our understanding of the manifestations of trauma that are specifically related to community violence, okay? And this is all, I would say, really coming out in the past 10 years and infiltrating practice in the clinical side and the community practice around public safety, and now it's being embraced by systems like educational systems or criminal justice systems. And so I'm just going to operate under the assumption that I'm in a room full of people who have had some baseline knowledge of trauma and fly through this really quickly so that we can have more of a dialogue. But when I do trainings on trauma exposure as a result of community violence, I usually break down the reactions in the following domains. So looking at cognition, looking at behaviors, looking at social interactions, developmental consequences, and then the physical consequences of traumatic exposure to violence. I'll maybe talk about one in each of these categories very briefly. So what's most typically observed in terms of cognitive patterns of those who've been exposed to violence is a dysregulation in terms of how people think and react to their circumstances. They can be completely numb to things that might shock other people, or they can overreact to insignificant events that might not bother other people, like somebody brushing against them in the train can cause an explosive reaction, or they can witness somebody getting shot in front of them and then go grocery shopping like they had just watched a cartoon, or had gone for a walk in the park. In terms of behaviors, what we might diagnose as a substance abuse issue is usually a coping mechanism to, they call it self-medicate, or find some kind of release from the traumatic stress and anxiety that people experience as a result of re-experiencing and being triggered continuously by that traumatic experience, all right? And using substances to manage those emotional reactions is often the only tool that's available to young people and adults who are growing up in contexts with chronic exposure to violence. In terms of social issues, we see difficulty with intimacy or forming trusting relationships with adults. So what I often hear from people who are starting to do work in this area is that, well, they don't want to work with me. And I often say, if you want to work with those who've been exposed to community violence, they'll be unpleasant to work with for a very long time. And the reason is that's the coping mechanism from having failed relationships, being hurt by other people, and seeing people coming in and out of their lives in a pretty rapid cycle. So there's difficulty developing bonds, trusting others, and having intimate relationships as a result of exposure to violence. There's tremendous developmental consequences, all right? So when we, in a school context, when we talk about kids not meeting age-appropriate developmental tasks or not performing at their grade level, usually it's a result of traumatic exposure and it doesn't have to do with their intellectual development or their intellectual capacity. It's that because of the circumstances in their community, it's impossible to concentrate, and it's disrupting normal developmental processes. And then finally, on the physical side, I can tell you which schools have students who have the highest rate of exposure to violence if I just talk to the school nurse and ask how many kids come in with migraines or stomach aches to their office. Because children most typically somaticize or express their trauma through complaints around how they're feeling in their stomach or through migraines, okay? But there's a whole other slew of physical symptoms or manifestations associated with exposure. So this knowledge around trauma as a result of community violence has been paradigm shifting in multiple practice settings, okay? It changes most typically what people say, our way of interpreting people's behaviors and lives, from criminal to clinical, okay? They're not bad people, they're hurt people. And if we're changing or shifting our paradigm of interpreting others' behaviors and lifestyles and choices through a different lens, then it necessarily changes also the way we respond to violence, okay? In terms of who we identify as a victim, all right? What the administration of justice means, okay, or how we attend to the victim, who we've identified. And then third, what is punishment, okay? Or what should be the appropriate consequences for somebody who inflicted harm and hurt somebody else, all right? And so I'll briefly talk about those 3 points to begin with, is that What I find when I talk about this topic to individuals who work outside of the context of community violence prevention and community mental health is that there's an idea, there's a set of very pure victims of violence who are going about their lives, had nothing to do with their own victimization, and that there's a set of evil people or bad people out there who wake up and decide they want to hurt somebody else or cause harm to others. All right? And what I can say is it relates to community violence, that is a false dichotomy. That is a complete lie. There's no scientific evidence of that dichotomy as it relates to community violence. Once you acknowledge the research that is mentioned around adverse childhood experiences, typical traumatic responses as a result of community violence, that there's a motto that's often shared among people who work in this field, which is hurt people, which has probably been uttered at some point in somebody's presentation already, is that if you want to identify who's going to cause harm to somebody else tomorrow, look at who's hurting today. All right? So this false bifurcation of pure and innocent victims, evil perpetrators is false. So that means that everybody's hurting, and at some point, everybody needed an intervention that they probably didn't receive. So then what does that mean is how we help those who've been affected by violence, or the victims, right, in a particular incident. What does trauma recovery mean to them if they're contemplating violence towards others? What's most accessible to them? What's most meaningful to them? And what allows them to give them a sense of moving forward and meaning in their life following that traumatic event? And then finally, what does punishment mean? Or what are consequences or accountability measures for those who've inflicted harm on somebody else? Recently there's a book released called Until We Reckon, which is written about a program based out of Brooklyn called Common Justice, which uses a restorative justice approach or an alternative to incarceration for violent offenders. And the program administrator had said something that really caught my attention, which is punishment is passive. Okay? So think about this within a parenting lens. That if one of my 5 daughters causes a fight with another one of my 5 daughters, and I put her in timeout in the corner, it's very easy for me. I can ignore her. She doesn't have to think about her reactions or what she did or how she hurt her sister, and then the hurt of her sister is unattended to. Okay? And that is basically, I would say, how I would characterize the responses that we have built through our criminal justice system. It's a passive punishment-based response that has no level of accountability and very low capacity for rehabilitation and restoration of those affected and the communities around them. Okay, so you can move on. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go over what's being done and then conclude with what is our opportunity as an Orthodox community, faith, and body in responding to those who've been affected by violence and restoring the communities that have been disproportionately burdened with violence. So usually when we talk about trauma-informed responses to community violence, there's 2 buckets that are discussed. So you can talk about the intervention side or the prevention side. Okay, if I were talking to a public health group, I would say we could talk about primary prevention or tertiary, secondary, or tertiary interventions, which is the first bucket that I'm going to talk about. So on the intervention side, there is a growing body of research on what law enforcement or policing looks like through a trauma-informed lens. In Chicago, most famously, we have a program called CIT, or Crisis Intervention Training for police officers, so that if they get a call and there's any indication somebody is expressing it under some kind of distress related to mental illness or substance use, right, that they're going to deploy an officer who's been through specialized training to respond and de-escalate the situation, and then make an appropriate referral based on the response. Okay, this has become increasingly popular and even mandated that all new recruits coming through the Chicago Police Department are mandated to go through 40-hour training on crisis intervention to reduce fatal and non-fatal shootings of unarmed citizens that may be expressing some kind of distress associated with mental illness or substance use, and also to protect law enforcement as well, right? Because there's been incidents in which they've been harmed, and responding to incidents in which somebody may be under the influence and cause harm Victim services, okay? So typically when we talk about victim services, it's providing some kind of case management and therapy on a time-limited basis for those who've been affected by a crime. Now, they're expanding in our state, and I can say that because of my role at the Attorney General's office, who they identify as a victim, all right, and acknowledging that even those who cause harm to others can be a victim at the same time, all right, and recognizing that time-limited clinical responses are insufficient, all right, in addressing the trauma recovery needs of survivors, that there needs to be some services must be community-based, they must be available regardless of somebody's documentation status or insurance coverage, okay, and provided by somebody who they can identify with, okay? So all of my accolades and titles from the University of whatever mean nothing if I can't relate or connect with the person who needs support. Comprehensive street intervention is also an initiative that's taking place in which individuals who typically come from or are formally affiliated with a gang or street organization go out, they do proactive community outreach to engage those who are most likely to be a victim or perpetrator of gun violence. They get cognitive behavioral therapy in connection with the street intervention and transitional jobs or employment to meet their basic needs. If we're thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that if safety and stability that are provided for employment, having access to food, and a roof over your head are not provided, then we can't ask people to change their behaviors and their cognitions and how they conceptualize violence and their trauma responses. I already touched briefly on community-based mental health treatment. And then finally, leadership development and advocacy work is seen now and recognized as a venue of trauma recovery. What does that mean? In this photo, you see here, these are all families that have lost children to violence or been affected by community violence. And part of their process of trauma recovery and making meaning of that loss moving forward is finding a way to share their experience with others, reach out to their community, provide healing opportunities and advocacy for safety and resources in the youth and their community for families. Okay, so on the prevention side, community mobilization and proactive messaging are two things that have been found to be very proactive or effective in trauma recovery as it relates to community violence. So in that snippet that I played earlier, where you see all these execution sites in Chicago, in these communities, violence has been normalized and accepted and becomes embedded within the narrative of their community and how they identify themselves. But if you can provide messaging that this is not something that you should have to normalize or accept, that everybody deserves safety, that children deserve to feel safe walking from their house to school, that we care about you, that you're not a scourge to our community, those who've been involved in harming others, that we care about you and we want better things for you in your life, that changing of the narrative in the community has been shown to have a trickle-down effect and actually reduce levels of violence. So think about it like your public health ones, and we wanted to create awareness around the harmful consequences of smoking or drug use, and you see, I remember growing up seeing billboards with the egg frying in a pan, you know, like this is your brain on drugs. That kind of stuff is happening at a local level in the community. These are the consequences of violence. This is what the future we want for you that doesn't involve violence. Engaging pop culture is another thing in social media. So neither are the scourge of our society, even though they can typically get cast as such. And typically the cultural expressions that come out of areas of urban violence are shunned. You know, like, oh my God, the hip hop music, or the rap music, or the profanity, or the way they talk about violence or criminal violence. And I would say that is not standard, okay? That a critical approach and examination of the cultural content that is produced within such circumstances has enormous potential to change minds, to change the way people think about violence and their identity in such communities. And there's many artists and initiatives that are engaging pop culture and social media to promote nonviolence and trauma recovery and accept and create a dialogue among those who've been affected. They can provide examples later if you're interested. Okay, so to relate back, and I'll probably be wrapped up in 10 minutes, so hopefully I'm falling within the presentation time. What does this mean for our Orthodox community, relating back to the theme, around isolation, violence, open communion? Okay. Do we have a responsibility as an Orthodox community given the circumstances that I've just described in Chicago and other major urban cities and internationally? Okay. And here are some of the responses explicitly articulated to me, or maybe less explicitly articulated to me in conversations I've had with parishioners, clergy, and others involved in different roles within our Orthodox Church. So one is that, well, these aren't our people. They don't come here. My parishioners aren't affected by violence. I understand it's like a really serious thing, but it's not happening under the roof of the homes of our parishioners and not being brought into the space of our parishes. Okay, it's not our issue, right? We really care about. I know there's hesitation and concern about taking on political issues. Okay, violence can be perceived as a political issue, and I understand that. And so there's caution in terms of how we talk about urban violence within our parish context, especially if it's not affecting the lives of people in our parish, and that it's also not our community. I mean, if you drove around Glenview, you'd be hard-pressed to find any public memorial of somebody who's been executed as a result of gun violence. Whereas if you walk one block in any community that's 15 miles from here, you could pass 20 memorial sites, okay? And so if it's not affecting our community, if it's not an issue that's being of concern to our parishioners and not affecting their lives, what is our role in thinking about trauma recovery and urban violence? And so to that point, and then I'm going to briefly talk about the lives of the saints, something that they may have to inform us about, is that there's a really also incredible book called, Brian Stevenson, anybody? Just Mercy, okay. And it's coming out in movies, and it probably won't be as great as the book, okay. But Brian Stevenson has an incredible initiative called the Equal Justice Initiative, which he did death row, he did defend death row inmates in the South, okay. And when he publicly speaks, he talks about this concept of proximity. And he said that if you want to resolve the most pressing social issues in our country, you have to acknowledge that there are great disparities that exist. So think about those maps I talked about at the beginning. And that if it doesn't personally affect me, or I'm not in relationship or communion with somebody who's affected, then why should I care about it? And that, I'm sure, is happening to all of us in the room, right? We maybe never cared about cancer research or supports for cancer survivors until cancer touched the life of somebody in our family, right? Same with urban violence, or incarceration, or homelessness, or substance use, right? And so he says that we need to talk about proximity and intentionally putting ourselves in communion, in relationship with those who've been affected, so that we can better understand the issue and figure out and prayerfully discern what is our response. So next slide. So I also want to say that this requires for us, as we ponder this question, acknowledging some uncomfortable realities. And I'm going to take 30 seconds to complain, about whenever, given the disproportionate burden of violence on poor minority communities and maybe an absence of response of the Orthodox community to those who've been affected by violence, that whenever MLK Day rolls around on Facebook and everywhere, we're posting this image, right, of Archbishop Yakovos marching with Martin Luther King in Selma. And there's a movie about this as well, and it's a very moving scene, and you can even hear an interview done by Archbishop Yakovos saying, as someone who was born in a society that disregarded people of my religious beliefs and ethnicity and placed under oppressive circumstances, I can relate or understand what is being experienced by the African American community here in the country. And he placed himself at the front of the march. Okay, that was 50 years ago. All right, and I always wonder, and then what? And then what? Right? That was 50 years ago. Okay, I'll stop there. Another uncomfortable reality. When people say, well, it's not our church, it's not our community, it's not affecting us. Here are two churches in Chicago. This is currently a mosque, and this is a Buddhist meditation center. These were Orthodox churches that were constructed as Orthodox churches. They weren't bought from a Protestant church or Baptist church or whatever. They were bought, the demographics of the neighborhood changed. Parishioners moved out into the suburbs. This is formerly Saints Constantine and Helen, Greek Orthodox Church, which is now Palos Hills. This is the south side of Chicago on King Drive, and it is a mosque. Here, I drive by this at least once a week. Okay, this is formerly St. Nikolai Serbian Orthodox Church in Chicago, which is now in Brookfield, where our family lives, right? And you can see where there's an altar, there's now a statue of Buddha, and there's meditation practices taking place. Same thing. The neighborhood, which was predominantly Eastern European, Serbian, Russian, Polish, became predominantly Hispanic in the 60s and 70s. Parishioners moved. Church administrators faced very difficult decisions, and they sold the church, and now it's a Buddhist meditation center. So to say it's not our community is false. Okay, so I would say that there is a missed opportunity, and I don't want to also undermine though the difficult decisions that church administrators must face, as we've seen in Chicago, for example, with Holy Trinity, Greek Orthodox Church, is that when your parishioner base is depleted and things are changing in your community, and there isn't a reminder of that in evangelical, I would say, or outreach mission of the Orthodox Church, that things can become very difficult to sustain. So, to conclude, I'm going to provide some examples of the saints and also an opportunity for us. Okay, so one of my favorite saints, St. John of San Francisco. All right, he, in his pastoral career, in his episcopal career, he was in the Philippines, on the island of Tubabao. He was in Shanghai. He was in San Francisco. So he was constantly ministering to a group of refugees who were under adverse circumstances based on, their citizenship status and constantly relocation. Okay, and this is based on a sermon he gave in Belgrade at the Second All-Russian Council Clergy and Laity of the Russian Church Abroad in 1938, reflecting on the circumstances in which he found the Russian community in Shanghai, in which he found high rates of suicide, he found high rates of unemployment and substance use and prostitution among mothers, because there was no outlet for them to sustain their families in a law-abiding, sustainable way. And he said, many Russians proved to be neither gold nor precious metal, but reed and straw that perish in the fire. Many were not cleansed and whitened by suffering. They did not endure the trial, but became worse than before. Many were embittered. Others, seeing no further purpose of existence and consciously give themselves up to vices or finding no satisfaction in anything, end their lives by suicide. Okay, so if we want to say it's not our people, it could be our people. Okay, St. John loved his Russian community, and he saw the context in which they were having to struggle to survive, and how they had lost a sense of hope and purpose, and that opportunities were not being provided to them, and he saw the negative consequences and shared it openly, okay? So just because it's not us, it doesn't mean it couldn't be us, right? This has affected Orthodox communities across history and across time in different political and social circumstances. To say that, to try and blame people for their circumstances, I think is short-sighted in how we think about trauma recovery responses and our Orthodox responsibility. Okay, second, Mother Maria of Paris, all right? So I'm just sharing snippets to kind of prep my concluding comment. All right, so in her pre-monastic life, when she had the name Liza, all right, she lost her daughter Anastasia to illness, all right? And so this traumatic loss of a child to illness generated a deep spiritual renewal within her. And she said after her daughter's burial, she became aware of a new and special and broad and all-embracing motherhood, in which basically she wanted to give her heart, okay, to all who need maternal care, assistance, or protection. And her monasticism was a special form of monasticism that was blessed by her spiritual father, who would concern himself with complete absence of even the subtlest barrier with which might separate the heart from the world and its wounds. Okay, now she lived during a time of massive upheaval, mass execution. She even offered to take the place, submitted herself to mass execution in the concentration camp to save somebody who was not Orthodox, but who was Jewish. All right, and so I want us to keep in mind her universal perspective of motherhood and how she transformed her suffering, all right, in her monastic life and to serve others. And then finally, I'm going to share a little snippet from Life of another one of my favorite saints, Saint Innocent, okay? And then I'll conclude. So Saint Innocent, in April of 1828, which is not springtime according to Alaskan standards, stopped at Akun Island on his way to Unamak Island, all right, in the Alaskan island chains, which was an unplanned trip. And when he pulled his kayak on shore, he found people were waiting for him. They knew he was going to arrive. And he said, "How did you know I was coming?" They said, "Because a shaman told us you were coming." So here you have somebody of nobility and great theological training showing up on an island, and somebody says, like, a shaman told us you're coming. So you could think of potential disdain, or like, oh my gosh, I can't believe a shaman is around here, let me put this in order. But no. He went to go meet with their local shaman, who was somebody who had prophetic capabilities, who knew when a whale might be beached to feed people at a time of famine, who had healed a woman who was dying, who was illiterate but had tremendous knowledge of the gospel and the Orthodox prayer life. And how did he know all of these things? Well, there used to be an Orthodox presence on this island, okay? Just like there used to be an Orthodox presence in somebody's community that I'm talking about. All right, so there used to be an Orthodox presence in the island. The former missionary there, all right, he was martyred, and 3 decades later, Saint Innocent showed up, all right? And in the absence of an Orthodox presence, all right, these 2 angels appeared to a local man, who the locals called Shaman, okay? He said, "White men, they live nearby in the mountains and they visit me every day," and the description he provided closely resembled archangels, all right? Then St. Innocent goes on to say that for the next 30 years, they taught him almost every day, either during the daylight hours or early in the evening. Sometimes they would pray to God together. And Father John says St. Innocent's name before he was elevated in the episcopacy, asked this local shaman if he could see the spirits. And he said, I'll ask them. And so he asked them and they said yes, but the angels or the spirit said to him, why do you need to see them if you're teaching us the same things they are? So he hesitates and he decides to write to his bishop back in Russia, Bishop Michael, and relays all of this and says, what should I do? Should I go meet these spirits? Am I worthy if they're archangels or archangels to meet them? And thanks to travel circumstances and tough weather, he got the letter back 3 years later, the response, all right? Bishop Michael, who said, just as in our church hymns, Thomas's doubt is called good. I, and many others with me, wish that you would consent to visit and speak with the spirits, doing so for the greater glorification of our pious faith. Whatever God grants you to know through the gift of His Christ, inform me when convenient, either by letter or in person, when in the future we shall have a welcome meeting. By the time he received this letter, 3 years had passed and the shaman had died. Okay? And so later, somebody whose name was Andrew Morava wrote the following account, okay, which is going to be leading to my last slide. He said, one scarcely knows at which to be amazed, the miraculous gifts of the old Aleut or the humility of the missionary, when patience is denied a singular opportunity to satisfy his obviously holy curiosity with such an unusual matter. The old man's premature death, however, vindicated his actions by showing clearly that these revelations had been necessary for himself, his family, and his people only for as long as the Aleutian Islands remained spiritually neglected, okay? Now, however, by the grace of God, people have come to work towards their salvation, and the heavenly guides conceal themselves once again. So, to conclude, all right, last slide. Hold on one second, I'm recording. We have a tremendous opportunity to heal others, but also in that process to heal ourselves. I actually believe it is strongly to our own spiritual detriment that we are not in communion and actively involved in the healing of those who've been affected by violence. And it can be done by the most simple things. So this is what I hear most typically, like, how am I going to go into that neighborhood and talk to people who've been affected by violence? Last night, Friday night, I'm in a support group for families with homicide victims. I got an email from a college student who said, I want to make buttons that say the names of the children who have been lost, the families in their group. Can I please make buttons and bring them to you? I said, absolutely. And she came, and not only did she prepare one button with the names of the children for each family, but she gave them 7 so that they could give them to their friends. And the parents wept over a button because somebody who came from outside their community cared about the name and the life that had been lost of their child, and wanted to give them a little way to recognize them and to share that recognition with others in their community. So if a button from a college student can mean something, we all have gifts, resources, and capabilities to attend to the healing and restoration of those who have been affected by violence. And so in this slide, this mother here lives in the south side of Chicago. She just created an altar in her backyard in which every time a life is lost, she writes a name on a brick and has made this huge altar so that people's lives are recognized, that we can commemorate them and think about their families. These 2 mothers have lost children to violence in Chicago. You're going to hear her voice, and that'll be the last part of my presentation, who pled for leniency at the sentencing of her son's murder. This mother, they have never found her child's murderer, but she actively pled for the community to forgive whoever caused this act of harm and for vengeance not to be sought, while the blood of her son is still all over the sidewalk. And she started a community group called Parent Angels to visit those who've been affected by violence, provide wound care, and mobilize communities, and provide care packages to those who've been affected by violence. So, I think about their examples, our own spiritual life, and that through healing others, we have an opportunity to heal ourselves, and that the smallest thing can have tremendous consequences. And so to conclude, I'm going to play 3 minutes from an interview of the mom on the upper right-hand side. So this is an audio recording project I did 2 years ago called The 2 Sides of Justice. And wait one second. And the purpose of this audio recording project was also to explore this false dichotomy, like people who are victims of violence come out victorious as a result of the criminal justice process. Those who are perpetrators are harshly punished, and they may, there's some sense of relief on behalf of the victim. I interviewed families who had a loved one incarcerated for a violent crime, and families that had lost a loved one to violence, and asked them, what does justice mean to you? How have you made meaning of your life following this incident? And so Lisa, think of this as like a recounting of the visitation of the angels to St. Innocent, is going to describe how she went to court, okay, to advocate for leniency in the person who murdered her son. Okay.
Yes, they did find the person that killed my son because he was shot in the incident. He was driven to the hospital by the person that he was with, and he was arrested. And he had been charged with first-degree murder, and his bond was $3 million. I felt bad for him, and I felt bad for his mother. Another mother lost her son today. He's been charged with first-degree murder, and nobody won here. And this isn't, justice. It's just another loss. And I just simply asked, pray for her, just as you pray for me. And that never changed. It took a little over 4 years before they began to prepare for trial. The case was in discovery for that entire time, meaning they were just gathering information. I had made a decision that the next hearing I was going to attend. That's when I was introduced to the Assistant State's Attorney, and she said, we're actually set to you know, we just talked. She talked about the strategy. She talked about what took so long. She shared the fact that witnesses have kind of fallen off, and that was more or less a tactic on behalf of the defense team. A lot of preparation on call. Be ready to hear some things that are not going to be great. Be ready to see some things, see photos of the crime scene. That was when I learned something that, again, my naivete. He's pleading not guilty. It never crossed my mind that all these years that I was feeling so bad for him because I believed that he was remorseful or feeling remorseful and feeling, you know, horrible about what he had done. That was a gut check moment for me, because now at that point I had entered the realm of restorative justice. This young man needed to have relationship, and he needed my love, even if it was from afar. I believed all those things, but now wait a minute, you're telling me that he's fighting for his life, and that means that they're going to villainize Darren in order to save his life. And it took me some time because I needed to ask myself, well, if you're having a problem with this, then I want you to take a look at what you say you believe. I had to go back to the facts versus the truth. When they're going to be disseminated in the way of information, it's just the facts. And it doesn't change who Darren was. Remember? It doesn't change them. So you gotta be okay with this, no matter what happens. You gotta be okay. And it took me having a couple of conversations with some real good friends to say, you do believe what you say you believe. You really do. But this is hard. This is some hard stuff. You just gotta own that. This is hard. What the assistant state's attorney said to me was that there's a possibility that we can't win this. And he might walk. Once I regained my composure, I said, you know what? If he walks, my prayer is that he makes different decisions in his life. That he walks away a new person, different than he was when he went in. Cheryl came back with another idea, I guess you could call it. And she said, what we'll do is we'll enter a plea. And I want to know how you feel about that. And I said, well, I want to know how you feel about it. I'm not the attorney, so you tell me how you feel about it. She said, well, I think we can do a plea. And the reason that I ask you how you feel about it is because I just want you to have closure. I want you to get justice. I said, let me stop it right there. I've not slept a single night in 4 years. I've gone to sleep every night since Darren died. This is closed because he's never coming back. And there's nothing I can do to change that. I said, but if you want to do something for me, and it sounds like you do, I said, my understanding is that a victim impact statement is typically only read when there is a guilty verdict. If there's a plea, then there's no verdict because the decision has been made, including the plea that he has to listen to a victim impact statement. And she said, okay, I can do that. So the plea was second-degree murder, 15 years, and listen to the victim impact statement read by the mother of the victim. And she called me Thursday and she said he accepted the plea. I need you to have your statement together tomorrow. I came to the court and I hadn't written it out. So they sent me up to an office upstairs to write it out. And, you know, they swore me in like I was a witness. And I read the statement. And I was looking at him and we made eye contact on more than one occasion. That didn't talk about the pain because it's painful. It's a loss for myself and his children. And so I did share that. I also said that even though I don't know what happened that day, there's just two things that I know for sure. And one is that Darren didn't deserve to die for making the worst decision of his life. And he doesn't deserve to spend any more time in jail for making the worst decision of his. I say, Your Honor, I just ask that you show leniency in your sentencing for this young man. Someone will always be in position to speak up for my son, but said what I wanted to say. To him and to his mother, I expressed unconditional love in that moment. And I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to know it.
And so it goes on for a few more minutes, but her plea for leniency in the sentencing was accepted. He served 4 years in prison for killing her son. He's been paroled, and that they've been reunited, and they are doing community work together, this mother and the person who killed her son. So I think about her and that expression of universal motherhood that Mother Maria expressed after the loss of her child, and see such intense parallels, right? So that's all I have to present. My contact information is here on the last slide, which I'm happy to share with others, but want to respect the excellent other presenters who are coming for the rest of the day and express my gratitude for the opportunity to share my experience, but also the perspective and lives of those who I've been privileged and humbled to work with over the past 15 years in Chicago. And so thank you.